Oh, wait, is it back? Okay, success. All right. Welcome, everyone, for that dramatic beginning to the March IGRI monthly research seminar. My name is Devor Mondam. I'm the IGRI coordinator, and I want to introduce this month's presenter. Aaron Deslatte is an associate professor at the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, Indiana University, where he's also the director of the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Laboratory, and he's also an IGRI affiliate. His research focuses on the roles that public managers play in enhancing economic, environmental, and social sustainability at the local and metropolitan level, with the goal of building cumulative knowledge which can help local governments advance sustainable economic and community development. His presentation today is titled State Reinforcing Knowledge Infrastructures and the Robustness of Urban Water Systems. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. Let me get rolling here, make sure we are seeing the screen. Okay. Excellent. So this is a collaborative effort that's part of an ongoing National Science Foundation grant to study the sustainability of urban water systems. On this particular paper, I have a number of co-authors who have helped me pull things together. A few of them are here in the meeting, thankfully. So my name's Aaron Deslatte. Also on this paper, we have Jeff Adams and Fazil Shima from Indiana University, Sarah Alonzo Vicario from Arizona State University, and Jesse Barnes and Elizabeth Cobley, who are both here from the University of Nevada, Reno. So the presentation will be pretty straightforward. I'll walk through a little bit of our theoretical setup. I'll briefly discuss the cases that we use to focus on. I'll talk about the methods, walk through some of the key findings. I don't have time to get through all the findings, but I'll try to highlight, I think, some of the most important ones. And then I'll wrap up with sort of where we are going in this project. So I want to maybe start off with a opening claim, which is that all organisms, species, and societies need to have accurate information about their environments in order to survive and adapt. And in fact, if we delve into the adaptive governance literature, adaptivity is typically defined as some kind of a function of the decision-making processes. And adaptive governance, in particular, decision-making processes that are flexible, subject to alteration, and iterative. And within this literature, probably a lot of you are familiar with it. There's been an interesting debate over the last few years as to how stable versus flexible the institutional arrangements or rules or policies should be to allow for collectivities, societies, communities to adapt to changing environmental conditions. And within that debate, I think there are two interesting sort of perspectives. The first is that really, maybe in the US context, but certainly in other contexts as well, the laws and the regulations, and in fact, the institutions that we have set up really create the illusion of stability. In other words, they're outdated. They're based on faulty assumptions. They assume things are going to be very linear and predictable in the future. They also make an assumption that if we degrade ecological states, they can be reversed or we can restore them, and that this is really an outdated kind of mode of thinking. Now, the counterpoint to that is that the existing institutional designs, rules, laws may still be able to provide some substantive flexibility and procedural discretion. In other words, they can, in some instances, possibly create enough room to maneuver. So policymakers and managers can try to promulgate new requirements. They can roll back poorly performing ones. And generally, there may be a larger space to operate in here than is recognized or acknowledged. And so one of the kind of inspiring or kind of influential papers for this effort that we're presenting today was from Daniel DeCaro and his colleagues, who highlighted in their 2017 Ecology and Society paper the role that legal and institutional designs likely play in creating some sort of balance here between stability and flexibility, and that these designs and even design principles are often overlooked in this discussion. So here is our research question. We're really interested, again, recognizing that adaptive governance hinges on information and information fed into decision-making processes. We're really curious how institutional arrangements support state-reinforced decision-making and learning about complex problems. In this case, the most complicated and pertinent being how organizations or how communities are adapting to climate. By state reinforcing, what we mean by that are the ways that governments and multi-level arrangements formally empower or constrain collective action, problem solving, and adaptive governance. So one of the ways our group has tried to go about looking at institutional designs and how they impact the management of common pool resources or resources more broadly is through something called robust control or the robust control theory or control theory, modern control theory. And what this is an idea that has come out of engineering and is heavily influenced by the IED framework. And it's an approach to study essentially heavily engineered infrastructure systems. So our study is in the context of urban water systems, but really coupled infrastructure systems, we can think of them in a number of different contexts like transportation systems, even information technology systems. But essentially, a portion of this system is sort of hardwired or physically engineered, and a portion of this system is really the soft infrastructure that is coupled together by institutions, by rules, by laws, by norms, et cetera. And so this approach really focuses on the system architecture and how the system architecture is designed to withstand disturbances, in particular to known frequency distributions. So heavily engineered systems typically look to the past. They have time series data. They try to design themselves so that variation in those inputs do not produce substantial variation in the outputs of the system. In other words, they try to design themselves to be robust. A core kind of objective in this research is to identify various types of trade-offs. One of those is called robustness fragility trade-off. And a robustness fragility trade-off simply means when we design these engineered systems to be more robust to high frequency events, for example, 1 in 100-year storms, what we're really doing, or what we run the risk of doing, is conserving fragility somewhere else in the system. So the system can become more vulnerable through the attempts to make it more robust. And so these robustness fragility trade-offs end up being pretty core to what we're looking at in the context of climate and environmental change. And to the right, we have sort of in this figure a depiction of a coupled infrastructure system, and in this case, a dynamical systems model, which was developed by our team, in particular Adam Weichman at ASU and his modeling team. And this particular model looks at or tries to model the institutional dynamics of this urban socio-hydrological system. Now, some of the limitations with this approach are that these types of models, and in fact the underlying systems, are often depicted as closed loop kind of feedback controllers or automatic systems that respond to changes in input variability. So in other words, the humans are sort of taken out of the machinery here to some extent in these models. And of course, we all know that in real political contexts, human decision-making is pretty core to how systems respond to emerging threats or changes in external sensory inputs. And so sometimes this is modeled or discussed as an institutional dependency. There's a large, obviously, literature that discusses this as information or institutional friction. And I guess the gist of this component or gist of this concept is that these human influenced or human driven systems oftentimes are too slow to respond to changing environmental stimuli. And as a result, they may not respond when they should, or they may over-respond to built up pressure or built up stress. So one of the ways that has been put forward to sort of address this or bridge this gap is something called knowledge infrastructure. And this would be kind of a portion of that soft infrastructure I just mentioned. And this is the other kind of core guiding article for our study today, and it's a 2019 PNAS paper that Marty Andrews, Matthias, and Jansen put out called Knowledge Infrastructure and Safe Operating Spaces in SESs. And the argument they make in this paper is that we really ought to be paying more attention to the various types of knowledge that gets developed, mobilized, curated, and used within these infrastructure systems. And they identify 4 particular types of knowledge infrastructure. This is not an exclusive or, exhaustive list, but 4 key types, and we focus on these 4 types in our study. The first is K1, experience or knowledge of the past, so longitudinal or time series data. The second is knowledge or information on the interactions between different ecosystem system components. So we can think of this as economic and ecological interactions, or other types of ecosystem dynamics that, again, you typically will need to rely on some scientific expertise to try and model. The third type, K3, is information or knowledge about future events based on the probabilities of uncertainty. So this might be attempts to try to ascertain how increases in extreme climate-related events are likely to impact a system. And then the fourth is just resource use or appropriation, so ongoing monitoring or self-reporting of the system appropriation within the system. And just the color coding here, just to jump ahead to the results, what we find in our cases is a heavy reliance on K1 and K4 in these urban water systems. Some reliance on K2, and a real lack of this K3 type of knowledge. So the adapting or using sort of climate modeling in attempts to make the infrastructure system more robust to climate is still a very large challenge. So where do the knowledge infrastructure systems come from? Who are the actors or the organizations in them? They can be varied. It can be universities. It can be national, state, or local governmental agencies. It can be the media. Can be community organizations, other resource groups. But the key is that everyone within these networks they possess unique assets which allow for information to be processed, curated, and distributed. And what we see here are just some of the entities that we identified in our cases. So the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the California Department of Water Resources, universities when they are involved in trying to assist in climate modeling. And then on the far right, this was the City of Phoenix's modeling of their time series. So water demand and population growth and how those two things are interacting or projected to interact in the future. So this is just another sort of visualization of the KI system, a knowledge infrastructure system. And what this is depicting is these 4 different streams of information flowing into what we're going to call, what we treat as an action situation, which is essentially a planning process. So the oval on the right is a action perception feedback loop. And it is a group that is tasked with planning, and this planning is a form of collective action, and that collective action is going to be influenced by these different streams of information that they have available to them. So K1 here in the middle is information on the state of the ecosystem. It can be the current state, it can be previous states, so this is where time series or history comes into play. K2 is trying to understand how various components of the exploited ecosystem are interacting. So this can be dynamics of the system. So what happens when population grows or population shrinks, or land gets further developed, or other kinds of social system components are impacted. K3 is trying to understand how uncertainty in the future is likely to impact the system performance. And then K4 is ongoing monitoring of resource appropriation. So all four of these streams have potential for noise, right, to be involved. And in some cases, some of these streams might be completely absent from this planning process. So let me quickly move on to our cases. We have 4 urban water utilities in the US that we are using for our cases. We have a paper that came out in 2022 in PSJ, which details our case selection process. We have a larger set of 16 urban water utilities in the US that we've been focused on for the last few years. We've selected these 4 because we can place them in this typology. And I'm going to argue that 2 of them, the 2 California cases, are cases of high state enablement. And what I mean by that is simply state enablement is whether the state formally enables the system with climate change adaptation, mitigation, guidance, discretion, or incentives. So they are either enabled or they are constrained essentially by formal institutional rules. The second sort of component of this typology is political autonomy. And in the interest of time, I'm probably not going to get into much of the detail here, but we can treat this as something else, at least, that we're kind of controlling for. And that's whether the system is owned or managed independently of the municipality. That's the gist of it. Okay, so for the study, we're using kind of an adapted version of the IAD framework. We have essentially our 3 exogenous features here: biophysical conditions, community attributes, and rules in use. And we have the action situations, which we're treating as these water planning processes. So we're examining water planning over several cycles or iterative plans that were developed. And we're looking at the contested welfare goals or evaluative criteria, right, that are present in these planning processes. We do look at a bit at the actors, the different actors that are involved in this process. But for the most part, what we're focused on in this paper is the different knowledge types. So the knowledge infrastructure that is present and is used over this time period. And the reason why I called it an adapted IAD is that instead of treating these exogenous features as static or fixed, we actually are allowing them to evolve over time. So we're studying, in this case, what changes with hydrological stream flow, precipitation, and storage, what changes in terms of media attention or salience pertaining to water issues, and then how the actual institutional design, in this case, really the state laws, change over the planning period. Here's our data types. We have essentially 4 different types of data that we use in the analysis. So for the institutions, we use the institutional grammar tool to gather a lot of different statements across from different sources for each of the cases. We have hydrological data that is, again, drawn from the PRISM model data set and daily stream flow. And we have media data that come from the primary newspaper in each of the 4 metropolitan areas over time, which we use that to do topic modeling or structural topic modeling. And then we have as our kind of dependent variable here, or the actual plans that are adopted and the content in those plans. And we augment that with interviews. And so I skipped over the hydrological section a bit, but what we're using the hydro data for is to essentially identify periods of drought or extreme wet periods to see how those play into essentially the planning process. So we had 2 steps for this analysis. The first was within case synthesis. And so in this case, we created data-driven narratives that talked about the governance context, the hydrology, the water salience, and then the types of knowledge infrastructure that were present at each of the time periods or the planning periods. Each of those data-driven narratives was about 2,000 words. And then we did a cross-case comparison where we looked at differences across the cases and what might explain those differences. So I'll jump into the results here really quickly, some of the highlights. So amongst the states, or I'm sorry, the cases that were low state enablement systems, this case, we're talking about Phoenix and Indianapolis. What we found are key kind of state constraints in the Indianapolis case, which prohibited them from adapting or incorporating climate data into their planning process. On the Phoenix case, that was actually not the case. There was attempt to try to various attempts to try to incorporate climate data into their planning. It was just hindered by the limitations presently on being able to downscale global climate models into predicting or anticipating changes in stream flow, et cetera. But across all four of the cases, we importantly found that there were ongoing efforts to try to improve the information that they were collecting about the system state, which is that K1, about the SES interactions, that K2, and about improved monitoring. So across all four cases, they were attempting to gather better information or to develop these knowledge infrastructure systems. They just faced sort of unique constraints. So this is a very busy figure, but it is our use of the IG here to try to visually display and identify these institutional dependencies. So in the top, the blue network diagram, this is Indianapolis. And in Indianapolis, what happens here is, so the utility is a nonprofit corporation. And it has its own unique sort of boundary rules which govern how the board of directors is appointed from internally. And so it is essentially a more politically autonomous utility. It doesn't have to directly answer to the elected officials of the city. And so the managers in that utility talked about how this gave them more political autonomy. They didn't have to worry about the political calendar. But they are still regulated by the State Utility Regulatory Commission, and that commission has the power to approve or disapprove of their future water supply plans. In this structure, they're not required to develop these plans. They may develop the plan. They have to submit it to the IURC, and then once it is submitted there, it's evaluated based on some pretty stringent evaluative criteria that we argue in the paper limits the welfare goals that they can consider. So I'll elaborate more on that in a little bit. The red on the bottom, the red diagram is Phoenix. In Phoenix, there is a different sort of means by which the actors enter into their position, so different boundary rules. City manager and the director are appointed by the city council or through the city council. So that's a more politically accountable institutional design locally, at least. And the utility director is required to develop a drought management plan, but the utility director has considerable discretion in determining when that plan should be updated and when conditions have changed to necessitate an update. So even though this is a more politically accountable plan, or I'm sorry, institutional design, there is considerable flexibility in this design for allowing them to pivot, right, when environmental conditions change. So let me try to just synthesize the findings from these two cases. We really find that in this case, there's kind of a cognitive break, if you will, between sort of how these utilities viewed themselves and how they were able to actually operate. So in other words, in Indianapolis, the utility managers really believed that their local autonomy allowed them to avoid partisan politics and the political calendar. Yet when they have to enter into planning, they're limited to these evaluative criteria of being reasonable, prudent, and reliable in supply development, meaning they can't really deviate from these welfare goals. And because they can't really deviate, it limits the types of information that they go out and seek. So they lacked across the time plan or across the planning period adequate data sharing, regional coordination, and multiple agencies made note of this. In the Phoenix case, despite the political challenges that they would face in raising water rates, the water utility actually progressively sought to develop more accurate predictions about the long-term climate-driven drought impacts on water supplies. So in other words, while there was a constant kind of concern about how elected officials were going to perceive the need of the utility to raise rates to make more investments, they were able to operate more freely in terms of what kinds of information they gathered. And that information then was used to justify these rate increases. So they had a lot more flexibility and to develop this kind of knowledge infrastructure. So one of the things that I think people are going to might say immediately, if you're very familiar with these cases, is that, well, of course, Phoenix did more. They've been in this 20-year drought. And of course, Indianapolis didn't. They're in this very conservative state. And I'm going to try to argue that's a little bit over reductionist because essentially all of the cases that we looked at when we look at the hydrological data, they're all facing stressors. If these four panels are the four different cases, and the bottom right panel is Phoenix. And we see all that red on the far right of the panel. That is the prolonged drought conditions that they have been in. But if we look above at the Geist Reservoir, that's Indianapolis. And what Indianapolis has experienced over this 10-year period from roughly 2001 to 2020, I'm sorry, but roughly a 20-year period, is the wettest hydrological period on record. So they actually are experiencing a substantial increase in precipitation, and it doesn't really show up in this figure very well. But despite that that wettest period on record, they still suffered a seasonal drought in 2012, and because of that seasonal drought, they had to impose mandatory water use restrictions. And subsequent to that, this sort of triggered a 2-year kind of head scratching on the part of the state legislature and on the part of business organizations and the utilities themselves about what they needed to do to try to improve coordination and information sharing and knowledge building to try to be better prepared for when these events happen again. And we argue that this is an example of conserved fragility, right? Of essentially designing the system to be more robust to certain stressors, and in the process becoming less reliant, or I'm sorry, less robust to others. And what do I mean by that? Well, Indianapolis, like many urban water utilities that are in the Rust Belt or on the East Coast, is a combined sewer outflow system that faces significant environmental challenges in addition to, and probably overwhelming, water supply issues. And so this is the topic modeling that we did from media coverage in the 4 cases. And in the Indianapolis case, which is the top left, we see 2 peaks, and those 2 peaks pertain to the water quality topic. And what was happening at this time is these are 2 wastewater rate increases that the utility had to impose in order to comply with an EPA consent decree to clean up its water supply, because as that increased precipitation is flowing, it's causing more waste to be to outflow into the water system. And they are in the midst of right now completing a massive infrastructure project to dig a giant tunnel under the city where they're going to store this waste in future events. So they are designing the system again to be more robust with the point of improving water quality. On the Phoenix side, though, this is the top right, Arizona Republic, we see 3 peaks here in media attention, and the topic that they are responding to here is water supply. And these 3 peaks correspond to when the utility had to propose to the council a rate increase in order to help them adapt the infrastructure. And they argued iteratively in these rate hike windows that they needed to do this because of the uncertainty of environmental change. And they successfully, in other words, used more and more information across these rate cases that they were developing to justify these rate increases. So the system, in other words, looks like it's more responsive to these changing environmental conditions. And it's more responsive because there's more diverse types of information they were able to pull into making these arguments, right? Framing this issue. At least that's that's kind of the conclusion, one of the conclusions we reached from sort of tracing these processes across the cases. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about California. So in California, we have what we classified the high state enablement systems, Santa Rosa, California, San Jose, California. Both of these water utilities are nestled on opposite sides of the San Francisco Bay Area, so they're very close to each other, should enjoy fairly similar hydroclimatic conditions, sort of. And in both of these cases, what we saw was much faster regulatory feedback loops. So they were iterating more quickly over the planning period. We observed that required regional coordination and then an iteratively more intense kind of knowledge development, curation, and mobilization. The last bullet point here is that in this system, they actually do have explicit sanctions. So there are penalties if the utilities do not actually comply with these requirements. So over the study period, the California legislature has imposed more and more stringent requirements on water utilities. Water utilities are required every 5 years to develop these urban water management plans. And after the 2007 to 9 drought, the legislature passed the Water Conservation Act of 2009, which set this 20% reduction goal. In the 2015 planning period, the legislature required utilities to start developing better narratives for describing the water demand management measures, to provide more detail on the measures they were taking and had implemented, to start doing a better job of estimating water savings resulting from changes in water codes and standards or ordinances. And so basically gathering better and better data, or more data. And then in 2018, after another drought, this 2014 to 17 drought, the legislature again came back with more requirements for data collection and analysis, and started requiring them to essentially start doing annual reliability assessments, to do drought risk assessments, to start assuming that when they do some of these risk assessments, that they're going to face the driest 5 years that they have on records. In other words, scenario planning, but with worsening scenarios. And then they had to, again, start explicitly trying to account for climate in their planning and how that could be impacted. They also had other things to do as well, such as assessing seismic risk, energy use, and doing a better job of monitoring kind of water loss. So here is the network diagram for what this looks like, right? This is a fairly, an even more complicated figure, but all of the dotted lines here are dependencies. They're institutional dependencies. And so just if we wanted to walk through this like it were a maze, the supplier here on the far right shall, at least once every 5 years, develop a water management plan. So the actual planning documents are the shaded gray here. But then they also shall periodically adopt a shortage contingency plan, develop a seismic risk mitigation plan. They shall attempt to incorporate or engage social, cultural, economic diversity in the water planning update. They had to, in 2015, develop better modeling or accounting for water losses and water savings. And then they had to start developing more formal drought risk assessments, or more frequent drought risk assessments, and water reliability assessments. So the color coding here also pertains to the years. So the green ovals are the most recent changes to, or additions to the planning process. And so I didn't mention it, but in the top left, the water suppliers are also required to coordinate with other area agencies, but they're allowed to participate in region-wide planning. So if they want to, instead of developing their own urban water management plan, they can pool together with their neighbors and develop kind of a regional plan if they so choose. So what do we take away from that? Well, it looks like a whole lot of planning, a whole lot of requirements, a whole lot of effort, and potentially a lot of planning fatigue. But one of the things that jumps out from the California cases is that even though there are more and more requirements placed on the utilities, there's a lot of flexibility built into the system for how they comply with those requirements. So in their water reliability assessments, they're given 4 different methodologies for how to calculate reliability. They're really given a lot of leeway in terms of who they work with, how they gather information, how they calculate, again, their projections. In the responses to in their water contingency planning, they're allowed to develop their own essentially contingencies. This is the part of the plan where they say, okay, in this level drought, we'll take these steps to restrict water use. And they're given a lot of, they're given some guidance, but again, flexibility. So we argue this is an example of the law of the design of the system being reflexive and allowing them to figure out essentially how to accomplish the goals. So California system again has more and more goals and more planning processes, but flexibility for achieving them. Conversely, Indianapolis does not have a reflexive system. And after the 2012 drought that I mentioned, the top 20 utilities in the state were surveyed and asked a series of questions about the regulatory process, and they uniformly identified the state's regulatory process as inhibiting long-term sustainability planning. And so that was, that wasn't a majority of the utilities, that was all of the utilities identified that regulatory process. So that's sort of the opposite of reflexive institutional design. The second kind of component, this is going back to that DeCaro et al. Paper, legally binding authority and responsibility. We do find some differences between San Jose and Indianapolis in this regard. I won't have time to go into that. That's for another paper, but both of those utilities, in the case of San Jose, that's an investor-owned utility. In the case of Indianapolis, as I mentioned, that's a nonprofit trust. Both of them are heavily overseen or regulated by the State Utility Commission, the regulatory commission, and that does place more restraints on their ability to develop rates and make infrastructure investments. So we did see that as a factor. But overall, California adopted explicit climate planning goals. This is pertaining to sort of responsibility, whereas Indianapolis effectively constrained those goals and made it more difficult to try to work climate into their sort of objectives. Phoenix, meanwhile, is kind of in the middle. They were iteratively doing more and more to sort of incorporate or bring climate modeling into their planning, even though there was not an explicit state requirement to do so. All right, so I'm wrapping up. Just sort of next steps, where we go from here. Well, we're interested in these robustness, fragility kind of trade-offs, but what we're kind of arguing in this paper, and I think what we can see, this emerging picture, is that underneath these trade-offs, there's an information trade-off that occurs as well. And that the information trade-off really is between how much of the effort is going to be made to try and explore for information versus how much effort is going to be targeted at exploiting available information. And those trade-offs in turn, we can conceptualize, again, as a regulatory feedback loop, a form of collective action, and a form of collective action which is inferential, meaning it's attempting to look into the future to achieve a goal. But that's the direction we're heading in, is to try and think more and more about planning processes as acts of collective action and acts of inference, and to tease out kind of maybe at a larger scale how information is influencing those trade-offs. All right, thank you very much. That's all I've got. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, go ahead. Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron, for presenting on that. And we'll now open the floor up to any questions that folks have. Yeah, Saba, go ahead.
Aaron, could you share anything about, anyway, first of all, it's really, really interesting, and it's been great to see your team's work sort of develop over some time. Um, what I have sort of a methodological question. What were your challenges that you encountered in doing your kind of IG coding and analysis?
That's a great question. So I think one of the challenges to take a step back from the IG is just to figure out the best way to integrate the IG in an interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary way with the larger project. And that's kind of one of the things, that I've been trying to think a whole lot about, because I love the IG and I love being able to sort of dig into what the formal design looks like, using that as a tool, and how do we incorporate that? So just in terms of internal to the, let me answer that part first. I think we've found that the IG in an interdisciplinary sense is useful for tracing formal processes, right? And identifying how processes should play out according to the formal design, and then looking for perhaps deviations or looking for things that formal process doesn't specifically articulate. So in the planning processes that I just sort of discussed, there's a whole lot in the Arizona case that happened informally, right? That happened because there was more flexibility. So we're not really certain. We look at how Phoenix, and that case is adapting to climate versus some of these California cases, which are more formally required to do so. We're not really sure if one of those approaches is superior to the other, right? If one's more optimal. But it gives us more of a clean kind of way to compare the two, right? So it's a little bit it's been, I think it's taken a while for us to get there, as you noted, but it's starting to. We're starting to kind of identify the process of creating those maps, of doing that coding as something that's useful for developing a better understanding of the process that plays out. The IG itself, just in terms of using IG, we struggled a lot with inclusion and exclusion criteria, because one of our big issues is the data that we're looking at, we're drawing it from multiple sources. We have to draw it from, in some cases, the state constitution, in some cases, in most cases, state statute. But then there are also, local city charters in some cases. Some cities don't have city charters, so it's just city ordinances. And in some cases, it's administrative code, and so the point is we end up tailoring the inclusion and exclusion criteria so that we weren't just capturing like collective choice rules or operational rules, or excluding operational rules, that we were capturing kind of a gamut of these that was going to be comparable across cases. That was a substantially iterative process itself, I guess. And so now that we've done that, we have that done for 8 cases. And so what we're trying to do now is kind of glean from some other folks in this consortium and try to start using large language models to see if we can start automating that process. We just recently started trying to do that in the last few months. But we have a large enough now corpus of coded text that we're gonna try to start scaling it up that way.
Great. Thanks, Aaron.
Dan, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. That was a really interesting talk. And as someone who's been trying to develop these ideas of state reinforcement, thinking with Saba and others about how to unite these with IGRI tool, is really neat to see you doing that. It just so cool to see framework being used in this way and it providing leverage and you developing it the way that you are. So I was going to point out some things that just kind of resonated with me. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about. So one of the things is I've been trying to give a lot of thought to institutional archetypes. And so in your cases, you were talking about, like in Indiana, there's this board makeup strategy and a certain relationship there with outside influences, like political influences in the state. And in Phoenix, these utility managers be appointed by the mayor, different sort of institutional archetype, and possibly these other ones. And so it's interesting to see that essentially what you're doing was sort of analyzing them in terms of their capacities, and then given those capacities, how they're responding in this broader environment in terms of what information they're looking for and everything. So that was one thing. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about like how much you were thinking about these as these sort of different archetypes with these different capacities and how that kind of played out. And the other thing I was gonna bring up, it's also interesting to see. So in these cases, which is what we say in the state reinforced self-governance framework, is that these authorities and responsibilities, or what you call these constraints, the specific type seems to matter vis-a-vis the archetype and the location. So it may be that there's enablement and authority in some ways, but then there's these specific restraints that end up really taking away the adaptive capacity of the entity in the system in a certain way. And it comes down to the balance, which is what we kind of predict. In some of my own cases, I have like a case where the constraints are so strong from the state that this solution just can't really, it is not flexible in basically any form. And so it's like what's being enabled in a way. But I thought that was interesting. So in any case, just interested to hear your thoughts about institutional archetypes, your interfacing of state reinforcement with the IGRI, that kind of stuff, and this sort of balance, whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever interesting.
Yeah, great question. So let me try to thread together kind of because there's some connections there between what you're talking about. I think one of the things is that something that we are struggling too with doing, we're trying to work on developing some archetypes that are more like coupled infrastructure system archetypes. So they would deal not just with the institutional design, but also with the hydroclimate, with other kind of community or cultural attributes, right, that are unique maybe to that context. And very quickly, right, you would just open a box and there's suddenly 200 variables in there. So it's the difficult thing when that's, I guess, kind of the goal of the archetypes, right, is to just decide what is the most essential kind of ways to delineate across a couple of dimensions here. And one of the things that we're still trying to validate is this taxonomy, this institutional taxonomy that we came up with a few years back at the beginning of this project, which is essentially like, 6 classifications for where to place these systems, these institutional systems, in terms of being completely politically accountable versus completely privatized. And the literature tends to treat this as a dichotomous measure. It's either privatized or it's public, but in reality, there are multiple, other categorizations in between. And one of the things that is happening when you are moving across this taxonomy is that there are different feedback loops that are being created, institutional feedback loops. And in my mind, not everything, but a lot of what we're interested in revolves around how to set up these feedback loops so that they are capturing as much information as possible and being as inclusive as possible of different perspectives, of different knowledge types, of different exposed communities, if you will, right? And so we have this taxonomy, and we're starting to now do a little bit more quantitative work to try to validate the taxonomy, but that's still just kind of one component, right, of the larger system, because as we saw like in last month's presentation, it seems like these systems, their institutional fit is something that needs to be more carefully accounted for, because they do tend to evolve to be to better sort of synced or adapted to the environment that they're in. And so I think to get to the point of I think the second part of your question, we're looking right now at the 2 California cases, because we picked them in part because they're very close to each other. They're both in the San Francisco Bay Area, but one of them is what we call a T2, meaning it's the municipal utility that has an advisory kind of board of utility commissioners that is really in charge of policy. And then the San Jose utility is an investor-owned utility. And we're looking at how they both essentially absorbed, dealt with the same droughts, the same periods of droughts. They're in similar, kind of hydrological spaces, but they responded very differently. And And so trying to, one of the things we're trying to do now is kind of tease out the extent to which, they were operating, the differences in how they functioned, how the feedback loops worked in those two systems. Because in the investor-owned utility, there's very much a reliance or free riding we can identify on the efforts of others, other institutions, other organizations in the environment to comply with a lot of the state requirements. Whereas on the municipal system, there was a lot of, it was much more responsive to environmental needs or demands, right? And so part of the explanation for that, I'm getting to the point here, I promise. Part of the explanation, at least that San Jose offered, was we just do what we have to do because we're constrained by the state, because we're an investor-owned utility, because they say we have to do all these things. We're not going to do really anything above and beyond what they require us to do. And, you expect us to do climate planning. Well, this agency over here does climate planning. We'll just lean on them to do this for us, right? So that instead of actively trying to build their own kind of knowledge infrastructure or build that, what we call that K3, they're trying to outsource it essentially, or free ride on efforts of others. And because in their argument, we are more constrained. We have more constraints placed on us. So we're seeing that it's at this case, it's kind of an N of one, right? But we're trying to kind of think through that.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I'll just make one comment and turn it over to other people. Yeah, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, because the way I translate it is the two California cases, these entities have different types of constitutional decision-making authority, essentially, and can decide their own goals and how they're going to pursue it more, and one versus the other. And as a result, the one that's more constrained in that level outsources information, also has different goals that it's trying to optimize. So one of the things I read into that is like the composition of the key decision makers of those entities really matters for goals and what information they're seeking and that kind of stuff, in addition to other constraints. But yeah, thank you. That was very, very interesting response and helpful.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question if someone has one. Right, then we will wrap up things here. Thank you, Aaron, for coming and presenting your work and your team's work. And thank you to everybody for attending and for the questions. And yep, we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.